Okay, it is time for Shannon Reads Those book, a sci-fi fantasy and weird fiction book, and a Game of Thrones-a-Thon book, which means it is, yes, a Game of Thrones by George R. R. Martin. I'm finally getting a chance to talk about the book itself. Yay! So this book is part of many different lists and adventures and explorations that I am attending to and working through, so it's kind of hard to figure out exactly how to talk about it here because it's part of different structures, but I'll do my best. It is the 27th Those book that I have read, and it makes that list for being on the Book Riot 0 to Well Read list. And I think it's probably on that one for being a very zeitgeist title. It's very in the now, it's very in culture. Whether or not you have read the books or have watched the TV series, you're probably familiar with Game of Thrones in some element. And then it on the sci-fi fantasy and weird list, it's obviously one of the biggest, well-known, well-established current fantasy series going on right now. It's the first in the Song of Ice and Fire series, and the series hasn't completed yet. So I have a sneaky suspicion they won't actually finish the series until after the TV series finishes out. I don't want to say too much on specifics because of spoilers, of course, but that's my general impression. That so it's so hard. So where do you even begin with this? If you are completely unfamiliar with this, it is a fantasy series, and following it has a whole other world called Westeros, and this book primarily follows the Stark family, and who are not in power. They're just a family, and the father is good friends with the current king. A lot of the push behind the story is power, hence a Game of Thrones. And I don't want to go too much into it, specifics other than that. I really love the Stark family, and it was actually kind of wild to go this far back for after watching 6 seasons of the show to try and like remember what the characters were like when you start the journey. It's really quite extraordinary, and it is also extraordinary how close this is to the first season. And I knew that going in, but I was still like, wow, this is really close. Like, I'm not sure how much more I gained from reading the book that I would have got from just simply rewatching season one. So that's a bit weird. But as I said, I knew that going in. I actually wrote down the differences, and from my recollection, it was very few, like extremely few. That said, I did understand the families better, not just the Starks. The Starks I get, but the other families, because there's lots of different locations and different rulers of their particular areas and families and how they're interconnected. I often call books like this fictional monarchies because it's really so much about the monarchy. Like, it really is power, ruling, keeping the power after you've gained the power, who gets married to who, establishing trade relations. These kinds of things are really the driving forces behind the book. But it's weird because it really is centered as as a fantasy novel, and it is that as well. But for me, the fantasy elements are really so much lighter than the fact that then this just sort of feels like olden times, people on horses, swords, fighting for power. You know, it doesn't feel like the fantasy elements are really, and they're not that prominent. And I would say, like, sort of like the average character in the book probably doesn't believe that they exist. So for me, that once I sort of figured that out, I was kind of like, is this even fantasy? Because if people in the world don't believe in the elements that they're talking about, that are possibilities, the fantasy elements, is it really a fantasy book, or is it really more about sort of strategy and long-term epic storytelling. Like, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just I really like fantasy, and I really like sort of like the magic elements, and and stuff like that. So it's kind of strange how much that isn't part of this, at least this book. So for me, that I would have to say is one of the things that once I caught on to, I was kind of like not really happy I figured it out. Oh my gosh. Anyway, some of the it's weird because like one of the questions I always ask myself with those books at least is whether or not I enjoyed something, and with this one I enjoyed it, but the process of reading it was really challenging. It's a very big book, it's a very long book. I had to dedicate, sorry, there's ambulance went by. I had to dedicate very particular specific time daily to get through it, and I read it more intensely than I would have a regular novel. I took notes. I have my whole notebook of notes, and I left a handy dandy where they left off on page at the end, and I wrote where all the characters left off on, because I don't know how soon or if ever I'll get to the next book. And then I even did family trees and all this stuff because I wanted to really get it, because I felt like that was something when I was watching the most recent TV season, season 6, I felt like there were some relationships between characters we hadn't seen for a while, and I was missing what was going on, and that was part of the inspiration to read the book, was to know it more intensely, and I definitely do. There were certainly some characters I didn't remember that well, or their families I didn't remember that well, in particular Caitlin and the Tullys and how tough they are. The Tullys are tough, man, like crazy tough, but there's some that grit is also pretty awesome. But yeah, so there's lots of interesting stuff and different ways to see stuff, even though generally it felt like most of this I was getting from the TV series. So it's kind of weird. I don't know. I feel like I'm struggling a little bit on this one in terms of whether or not I'll continue the series. I feel like it's going to take so long. I did keep out A Clash of Kings, and I think the next thing I'll do is that I'll watch the season 1 of A Game of Thrones and then get a sense of, if I just rewatch the series, will that be enough? And that's for the Thrones-A-Thon. But in terms of a book, like, am I happy I read it? It's like, yes, in terms of the fact that I feel very accomplished that I made it through. But then when I sat down and thought about all the different book series, especially the fantasy series that I want to read that really are long and they have big, chunky books, and I'm like, do I want to spend that much time reading a series that I'm already quite familiar with and can enjoy in another method? So I don't know. And it's weird because when I was watching it for the majority of the time, I was sort of seeing the actors or hearing the actors' voices, and that's kind of strange, but it's also kind of cool. And that's the other thing, that even though, like, for me there wasn't as much fantasy that I liked, I did love the characters, and that had a lot of heart to it, and would be probably the reason I would keep reading over the fantasy element would be the character element. He does do something different in terms of that each of the chapters follows a different character, and so I put little flags for each chapter and who it followed, because I wanted to see sort of how many were about each person and that kind of stuff. So that was really fun to do. I also made notation every time there was what I call gender crap, so that can be anything from sexism to disparaging comments to like full on like sexual violence, and that definitely happened a fair amount, and way more than I'd like to make note of, but it actually also wasn't as much or as intense as I thought it would be. So that's something that, again, hesitant to keep going, because I have a feeling from people I know that have read it that it isn't going to get any better, and I don't know if I want to immerse myself in that. So that makes it challenging for a lot of reasons. So I don't know. Like, it's hard because it's like, should I just watch the series? Should I do that? Or should I keep reading the books? I don't know. I am happy I read it. It did really establish a very strict reading schedule for me, which I don't know how good that is. Like I really had to like to get through it. It was work. It was work, and that's not necessarily how I want reading to be. Like it's good to be able to do the things that you want to do, but then when you look back on it, is like, is that like, is that the way in which I wanted to enjoy it? And is my goal enjoying it, or is my goal being informed? You know, like for me, I really wanted to know the families better and understand that better. That certainly happened. Does it happen more than if I would have rewatched the show or write a Wikipedia page or something? I don't know. I don't know. Is the time and effort worth the results? You know, that's one of the things that you can only project forward, but you can't go back and change your mind, you know, because it's already happened. I spent the time, I finished reading it. So, but I started it in September and I finished it in December, like late September and early December, but still. And there was my sister visited in the middle of that. So, like, honestly, it's extremely dedicated reading for 4 to 6 weeks to get through one of the books. And for me, that's a little heavy. That's a little more than that, sort of gets it out of gets it into have to as opposed to enjoyable. So I don't know what I'm gonna do. I don't know what I'm gonna do. But for the books, I am gonna watch the series, and I'll probably share my thoughts on season one once I'm finished. Because I did say that I was gonna do that as a part of the Thrones-A-Thon. But the Thrones-A-Thon itself, I don't think I'm gonna continue. There's no way I can finish all the books and watch all the seasons before it comes back. Even though I don't think we have a date yet. But it's just not possible. So that won't happen. So it's kind of sad for me because I feel like the Thrones-A-Thon was a bit of a bust, and I know that I had people that were following along. Thank you so much for coming on the adventure. I hope that you kept reading and kept enjoying it. I don't know what I am going to be doing in that respect, but it was quite an experience. It was quite an experience. So we'll see what the next experience takes me on to. I have a feeling I might want to get to some other big epic fantasy ones that I have no familiarity with before coming back to Westeros in book format. I may just enjoy it on the TV. So let me know your thoughts in the comment below, especially on whether or not you can consider it fantasy, because there's really not a lot of fantastical elements here. Not a lot. The average folk, they don't believe. They don't believe. Interesting, interesting. All right, thanks for watching.